By a show of hands, how many of you would agree that the state of our American Union is in trouble right now? I invite you all to cogitate about the last communication style that you just heard. Instead of describing my communication style, I will just show you my communication style. A few years ago, our president gave the State of the Union address. The president has to give that address because it's actually mandated by the Constitution. Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1. It says, from time to time, the President of the United States will meet with members of Congress and give to them such measures as he sees as necessary and expedient. The foundation for the authority of that speech comes from the Constitution, which itself was created to address the State of the Union. In 1787, 4 years after we became a country, our small America was actually being threatened by greed, abuse, discrimination, and those types of things. The foundation for the Constitution is actually the Declaration of Independence, which gets its authority from the goodness and the men and women who came together to put that document together. 1776, it had to address the State of the Union because once again, the greed, the oppression, the discrimination drove the founding fathers out of Britain and out of Holland. So the question is this: if goodness has always been needed to address the state of our union, for the sake of our union, where does that goodness come from? And the question that I've always raised is, can you be good without God? We're a Christian club, so I can raise that question formally. And here is how I articulate my thoughts. Thought number one. Many times people will say, well, there are people who don't believe in God who live very good lives. But that isn't the question. The question is not, can you be good without belief in God? The question is, can you be good if God does not exist? In life, if you do not have an objective reference point, you would not be able to tell the difference between up and down. During his speech, the president referenced what was called the Cajun Army. If you remember, there was bad flooding in the South. And men and women were jumping into the water to save people. Without some objective reference point, they wouldn't have known up from down beneath those waters and would have only added to the casualties. If there's no God, we have no objective way of saying what is good and what is bad. And everyone's viewpoint becomes equally valid to everyone else's. It would be like if I said, blue blazers are the best blazer you could buy. The preference is in the subject, John, not in the object. So it doesn't apply to any other subjects. Richard Dawkins, Professor Emeritus at Oxford, says, without God, there's no up, there's no bottom, there's just pitiless indifference. God provides, on the basis of his unchanging nature, commands. And from those commands forms our morality. And on that basis, we can affirm things like self-sacrifice and valor as being very good things. So medieval philosophers, when first poised with this question, I'll figure that word out, they asked themselves, well, is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is already a good thing? And we actually realize now in recent scholarship that's actually a false dilemma. God wills things because God itself is good, and from God's goodness, it issues commands. God does not have a gender. If atheism is true, you and I are the accidental spin-off of the evolutionary process. And if that's the case, that makes you and I nothing better than animals. And animals have no moral obligations to one another. If a cat kills a mouse, the cat hasn't murdered the mouse. It's just being a cat. So on that basis, we wouldn't be able to say anything is wrong. Not abuse, not intolerance. There's nothing that we could say is actually wrong if you and I are just animals. However, even atheists don't agree with that view. Sam Harris and even Professor Michael Roos from Florida, he writes and says, the man that says it is morally acceptable to abuse small children for fun is just as incorrect, watch this, as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. That it isn't about the subject, it's actually about the object of the action. Our physical senses convince us that the physical world is objectively real, not an illusion. And in the same way, our moral senses convince us that the moral world is objectively real. Every time you say, that isn't fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you are affirming your belief in objective morality, not subjective morality. So we can summarize my thoughts in an argument that's defended all around the world in 3 premises. Premise 1, if there's no God, there's no objective right and wrong. Premise 2, there are objective rights and wrongs. Therefore, premise 3, there has to be a God. In the closing of his speech, President Trump said this: we need to rediscover America, a profound statement. I invite you to cogitate for just a moment on it. We need to rediscover America. In his speech, he said, it is faith and family, watch this, not government or bureaucracy, that forms the foundation of our government. That's an amazing speech. And then he actually said something many people don't affirm, but he said this. He said, I want to remind you all of one thing. Our motto is in God we trust. His speech, the Constitution, the Declaration, and the men and women that helped found this country, all of them did that to address the state of the Union for the sake of the Union, out of the goodness of who they were. Peter Kreeft and a lot of scholars have said that the American people, after we just turned 243, if you didn't know that, have, for the first time in our history, on all fronts, reached crisis mode. All fronts. Financially, emotionally, relationally, you name it, especially spiritually. Think about how bad it can be and then make it worse. The numbers would shock you. So the question before us today, the challenge that I lay before your table today, is that this is not just a speech. This is actually an invitation. I'm actually genuinely talking to you. Are you willing to do the only thing that's gotten our country to this point? Are you willing to help me address the state of our union for the sake of our union? Thank you.